This week we are going to continue talking about the Cold War in Latin America, but whereas last week we looked at Cold War revolutions, this week we're going to examine the reaction to the revolutions, which were military dictatorships. And before doing so and going into the dictatorships, I want to elaborate a little bit more here on U.S. policy towards Latin America during these years. And as the outline says here, there was a secret war between Cuba and the United States. And I call it a secret war because it was never a war that was declared between the two countries. And it was going to be fought throughout Latin America. And the key figure in this secret war was Ernesto Che Guevara, who you see here on the bottom left. You might probably recognize that image. It's a very famous image from Latin America. And Che, as he was called, he was originally from Argentina. And he was kind of a bohemian type figure. He had studied medicine and he was traveling around Latin America in the early 1950s. And he was actually in Guatemala in 1954 during the coup. And he, of course, was very affected by that. And afterwards, he made his way to Mexico, where he met Fidel Castro, who was then in exile after being kicked out of Cuba by the Batista regime. And Che and Fidel become friends, and Che is going to join Fidel when they sail back to Cuba in late 1957 to launch the Cuban Revolution. And Che, in many ways, was Fidel's right-hand man. And he's the very important figure in this secret war between Cuba and the United States because he serves as kind of like an international ambassador of the Cuban Revolution. And he was also its theorist. And he elaborated on a lot of socialistic principles, and also he theorized on guerrilla warfare. And ever since the revolutionaries in Cuba came to power in 1959, they immediately began to try to export their revolution. And that was because Cuba felt isolated. So it wanted to create other Cubas throughout the region, so they would have allies to confront the United States. And from the beginning, hundreds and even thousands of Latin Americans throughout the 1960s would go to Cuba, where they would receive military training by the Cuban government. And from there, the Latin Americans would return to their home countries, where they would establish what were called FOCO insurgencies. And I have that written here. And FOCO in Spanish means to focus. And the idea was that you would have a small FOCO group insurgency in the countryside, and it would lead to a popular uprising throughout the country. And the idea was to replicate what had happened in Cuba, where a small revolutionary group in the mountains inspires other resistance of people in the cities, which eventually leads to a mass insurrection and the overthrow of the government and the coming to power of a revolutionary regime. And really, beginning in 1959, there were FOCO insurgencies that were established in many countries. So in 59 alone, Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, FOCO insurgencies were established. Later in 1964, Argentina experienced a FOCO insurgency. In 1965, Peru did. And in 1966 and 67, Bolivia also had a FOCO insurgency. And Che Guevara himself went to Bolivia, where he led this insurgency in the countryside. And the idea, again, was to replicate what had happened in Cuba, recruit among peasants, get your message out through the radio and through propaganda, make alliances with urban labor unions, and promote a general revolution. Well, all of those FOCO insurgencies that Cuba promoted ended up being defeated, and they were all failures. And the only one that lasted for a long time was the one in Colombia. The Colombian guerrillas, who we'll read about this week in the Colombia Reader, they were able to last really until just the last decade. There's been a guerrilla insurgency in in Colombia ever since the early 1960s. And one of the reasons why the Colombian guerrillas were able to last so long was because eventually they would become involved in the drug trade, which was extremely lucrative and helped them to survive. But back to Bolivia. Che goes to Bolivia in 1966, and the FOCO insurgency in Bolivia was a failure, and it did not lead to the uprising of masses of people. They did not join the the FOCO insurgency. And the CIA had trained the Bolivian military to hunt down Che Guevara. And that's what you see here on the image on the right. Che was eventually captured in 1967, and he was executed. He was put to death there in Bolivia. So that ended Che's life, and a lot of these, that kind of ended the cycle of these rural uprisings as well. They decreased afterwards. As these revolutionary insurgencies spread throughout Latin America, John F. Kennedy, remember, who was president in the early 1960s, he responded to these revolutionary movements by promoting his program that was called the Alliance for Progress. And the Alliance for Progress was the United States' response to the Cuban Revolution. And the idea was to sway people away from communism and from joining revolutionary movements. The U.S. became very concerned about the spread of revolutionary movements. And rather than just using an iron fist in the militaries to put them down, this was kind of more of a political centralism, right? Kind of find a middle road to undermine communism in Latin America. And the United States would provide economic aid, would even advocate for land reform, and would also promote social reforms to alleviate poverty in Latin America. And so there were literacy campaigns, there were campaigns to build health clinics throughout the region. And it's quite surprising that even the United States was promoting land reform, because the United States had always opposed land reform in Latin America, especially in the Guatemalan Revolution in the early 1950s. And the results of the Alliance for Progress were not that impressive. Number one, a lot of the governments in Latin America themselves, and the elites in particular, did not go along with these reforms, and particularly landowners opposed land reform. So, most countries still did not undergo a land reform. Also, aid came in the form of loans and not grants. And perhaps most importantly, the United States Congress never really fully funded the project, and most of the aid went to the militaries and not to the poor. So while the Alliance for Progress, it sounded really great, it really didn't work in practice. And of course, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was not as concerned with the Alliance for Progress and was going to use the military option to resolve these conflicts in Latin America. So that brings us to the Mann Doctrine of 1964. And by this time, Lyndon Baines Johnson had assumed the presidency after Kennedy's assassination. And Johnson, he's not going to be so much concerned with the Alliance for Progress. Instead, he's going to focus on military solutions to Latin America's conflicts. And the Mann Doctrine, it was named after Thomas Mann, who was an American diplomat who had worked his way up through the State Department, and he was Johnson's point man on policy towards Latin America. And under the Mann Doctrine, the U.S. shifts its military policy towards Latin America from conventional war to counterinsurgency. And this was done in order to combat revolutionary movements and undermine communism. And usually when we think about the Army and its role, and the military and its role in society, it is there to defend the nation from external threats, right, from foreign countries that invade. But now the United States is starting to see the threat in Latin America from within, from its own people, rather than external countries such as the Soviet Union, which might invade the region. And as I mentioned, the Mann Doctrine, it moves U.S. policy away from the Alliance for Progress, and now the United States is going to support regime change in Latin America. And the United States is not going to be concerned about whether these new governments come to power through elections. If they come to power through a military coup, the United States will tolerate it and even support it, as we'll see. And this is what paves the way for the rise of military regimes throughout Latin America beginning in the mid-1960s. And it prioritizes U.S. economic interest over political reforms. So the Alliance for Progress had been focused on promoting reforms throughout Latin America, but now the U.S. wants stability and wants to protect its economic interest in the region. And indeed, in 1964, when this policy was outlined, it was done in about March 1964 when it became official American policy. Just a month later, that was when the military coup in Brazil occurred. And that's what we're going to turn to now in the next lecture, are the national security states and the dirty wars.